Being an American, it gives me great national pride that right now in Syria, thousands of poor people are dying thanks to our government's efforts. Okay, that sentence was actually a test. If you thought it sounded insane, then congrats, you win a little pin that says not a psychopath. If you thought that sentence sounded fine, then you currently work in the US government. And you don't get a pin. Syria has drifted from the headlines recently because the US no longer has anything to do with it, except stealing their oil, occupying large swaths of their land, economically obliterating them, and Joe Biden dresses up as a pantsless President Assad for every Halloween. At least that's what people think he's dressed as. And for him, Halloween is roughly every 7 minutes. The US-led war against Syria quietly continues with hardly any Western media talking about it. But this month, a UN special rapporteur came back from Syria and immediately demanded an end to all sanctions imposed by the US and our allies.
The economy is hostage to a protracted economic crisis with growing inflation and frequent devaluation of the national currency, all of which have eroded to the level of total extinction the purchasing power of households which find themselves in a prolonged state of survival mode.
Survival mode. Most Syrians can do nothing but hope they can survive. These are not fighters, all right? These aren't terrorists hurling grenades at Americans. These are completely regular people who spend every day trying not to die by American semi-automatic assault sanctions fired directly at their faces. And you might go, well, that's the Syrian government's fault. Why don't they just give the people what they need, man? And to that, I say, your point would have been better taken without the man. Next time, try dude or chap or broham. But the Syrian government can't help their people because the US and our allies have made sure they can't help their people.
The imposed sanctions have shattered the state's capacity to respond to the needs of the population. The crisis is exacerbated by the country's financial isolations with the sanctions designation of the central bank and all public financial institutions, thus completely blocking transactions for imports and exports, including of food, medicine, spare parts, raw materials, and items necessary for the country's needs and economic recovery.
The US has cut most Syrians off from much of the food, medicine, and raw materials they need to live. But that's a good thing, because you know what they say. Every time a Syrian infant doesn't get the food or medicine they need, an angel gets its wings, and a neocon overcomes his constipation. It's tough to overstate how bad things are in Syria. 90% of all Syrians today are forced to live below the poverty line, with around 12 million grappling with severe food insecurity. 90%! We've turned 90% of that country into a starving hellhole, and we're supposed to be proud of our country? Proud of good old Uncle Sam? It's like when my alcoholic uncle wanted me to be proud he managed to accidentally drive his car over our neighbor's mailbox instead of ours when he parked it in the middle of our jungle gym. Pride wasn't the word I would use to describe it. We have proof that sanctions, or economic war, kill thousands, if not millions. They even cause immense death and suffering when done to our own people. You see, when economic war is waged against a country's own citizens, it has a different name. It's called austerity. And a landmark study in 2017 found the conservative UK government committed economic murder, linking the country's austerity to 120,000 deaths in just a few years. I knew Boris had some bodies in his basement, the ones he didn't eat with brown sauce. Oh, brown sauce. So if that many people are murdered by cuts to welfare and healthcare, just imagine the number of deaths of innocent people caused by not even having clean water in Syria. Similarly, a former UN rapporteur on human rights said in 2020 that US sanctions in Venezuela have killed 100,000 people there. Last year, the UN Human Rights Council demanded an end to all of this unilateral sanctioning garbage. They said, punishment of innocent civilians through government sanctions must end. The experts underscored that people in targeted countries like Venezuela, Cuba, Syria, and Iran sink into poverty because they can't get essential services like electricity, housing, water, gas, and fuel, let alone medicine and food. Food, medicine, fuel. I mean, do you have any idea how important electricity is? I was in New York City during the blackout. It lasted 47 hours, and by the end of it, half of us were married to people we'd never met, and we were eating stale hot dog buns we stole from a homeless guy who'd been using them as insulation in his jacket. It was horrible. The U.S. also passed the so-called Syria Civilian Protection Act in 2019, imposing secondary sanctions on all non-U.S. citizens who deal with the Syrian government in any way. The Syrian Civilian Protection Act. Meanwhile, according to the UN rapporteur, maintaining such sanctions may amount to crimes against humanity. So, one may at some point ask, what does the U.S. actually want in Syria? In fact, German outlet Deutsche Welle asked recently, what does the U.S. actually want in Syria? U.S. troops have been stationed in Syria since 2015, and in 2018, the Washington Post said, U.S. troops will now stay in Syria indefinitely, controlling a third of the country. But luckily, last year, the U.S. government reviewed their goals. They came up with 4 priorities in Syria. First was continuing to fight ISIS. And thank God, because every American has had a tough time with ISIS recently. I mean, I was at a movie theater in Newport News a couple weeks ago just trying to catch the latest Puss in Boots flick. The place was crawling with ISIS fighters. Can't get a popcorn because ISIS took it all. Can't make out with your kid's nanny in the back row of the theater because ISIS is already in the back row making out with their nannies. Can't use the bathroom because ISIS closed it down to clean it. But still, other than ISIS, American priorities in Syria include supporting local ceasefires, stabilizing the area and helping with humanitarian aid and access, as well as pressing for accountability and respect for international law while promoting human rights and non-proliferation. Stabilizing the area? The U.S. is the largest destabilization force in the world. We're like the broken stiletto of countries, and here we are telling everyone we're there to stabilize things? We funded and armed terrorists that caused this war in the first place while calling them moderate rebels. We also say we're there to help with humanitarian aid and access. We're the catastrophe. We're why they need humanitarian aid. Claiming we're there to give humanitarian aid is like leprosy telling you it's on your body to help you find the body parts that fell off. Yeah, it's a good thing I'm here to help you look for those fingers. I'm on the case, buddy. You leave it to me. Have you tried calling them? You know how it's easy to tell we're not in Syria to help people? We're on the same side as Al-Qaeda. Seriously. In fact, thanks to WikiLeaks, we have an email from Jake Sullivan to Hillary Clinton. At the time, Jake Sullivan was Obama's policy planner. Then under Trump, he was, I think, a junior manager at an Applebee's maybe. And now under Biden, he's national security advisor. He wrote to Hillary, Al-Qaeda is on our side in Syria. Wow, tough to misinterpret that. So the American government is on the same side as terrorists in Syria. They're on the same side as Nazis in Ukraine. They're on the same side as murderous butchers like Saudi Arabia. Same side as the worst polluters in the world. Same side as sexual predators like Joe Biden and Donald Trump. But our government is on the opposite side from truth tellers like Julian Assange, Edward Snowden, Chelsea Manning, Stephen Donziger, and that octopus who predicted the World Cup winner. They imprison people trying to save the planet. They arrest people trying to feed the homeless. You can learn a lot about someone by the friends they keep. Remember that photo of Ellen DeGeneres hanging out with George W. Bush? I never trusted Bush again, nor W. So now that it's quite clear America's stated reasons for being in Syria and waging economic war against them are bullshit, what are the real reasons? Well, one is to steal some fresh oil. Just this summer, U.S. troops looted 84 oil tankers from Syria and smuggled them into Iraq. In fact, the U.S. controls 90% of Syrian oil. The actions carried out by the U.S. constitute state piracy with the aim of plundering Syria's oil reserves and depriving the Syrians of their own resources. I mean, what's the point of destroying millions of lives if you aren't going to plunder a little bit, right? But the truth is, stealing oil is just a side hobby for the US, like crafting dolls out of scabs is for me. The real reason we've destroyed Syria is to protect our dollar, and by extension, our power. US power comes partially from the petrodollar. Most oily countries that drop the petrodollar are later invaded or otherwise attacked by the US. A couple of years ago, before the US invasion of Iraq, Iraq dumped the US dollar for the euro. Before the US and NATO invaded Gaddafi's Libya and saw him murdered in the streets, he had been working on a plan to switch much of Africa to a gold currency. In 2007, before our recent aggressions towards Iran, including Trump's assassination of their top general with a drone bomb, Iran had stopped selling oil in petrodollars. And before our invasion of Syria back in 2006, Syria stopped selling oil in dollars. Much like this shirt, I'm starting to see a disgusting pattern. Makes me want to vomit. Also might be that guy's cologne. There are also some other reasons the US empire shat on Syria, such as turning it into a nearly failed state left Iran alone in the region as a counter to US-Israel hegemony. Look, I don't love saying it, but our American government will watch as hundreds of thousands of children starve to death if they think it will help consolidate the US empire's power just a little bit. As Madeleine Albright once said, we think it's worth it. And that is why they won't leave Syria alone. And that's your most censored news for this week. We've also started doing interviews with amazing people. You can catch those live streams every week. I've talked to Stephen Donziger, Chris Hedges, Scott Ritter. We got Greg Palast coming up this week and Richard Wolff soon. I hope you'll check that out. It's at youtube.com/behindtheheadlines. Also, we are completely and utterly independently funded, which is not easy. So please become a patron on Patreon and keep fighting.